So a mutation is a genetic variation. So, Rudy can explain this better, but if a letter is upside down, or a letter is in the wrong sequence, or a letter is missing, that's a genetic mutation, right? A variation. So genetic mutations occur across eons of time, and according to Darwin, they are random, correct? And then there's natural selection. The mutations that dominate naturally select themselves to reproduce themselves. Now, you and I know that Darwin, the greatest scientist of all time, in at least biology, in his time, there was no knowledge of genetics, DNA, epigenetics, microbiome, and how experience shapes these activities. So for about 20 years now, I've been suggesting that evolution is consciousness driven.
Yeah.
What's your reaction to that as a scientist?
Well, evolutionary biologists who are hardcore Darwinians will say all mutations are random. An actual wet lab scientist who works at a bench with DNA, and we'll call wet lab, we would never say anything's random. So there's a big difference between the evolutionary biologist who's pontificating on an armchair versus one who's doing work at the bench. At the bench, any change in DNA, even if it's in one of the so-called junk regions or intergenic DNA, to say that's random is just irresponsible, because everything has a cause. So then you have to say, okay, maybe we won't find the pattern behind the cause, but it had a cause. And I'm struck by the newer realization that, there's a study where male mice were trained to be afraid of the smell of cherry. They use an ester, a chemical ester that smells like cherries. And when a mouse smelled the cherry, they would give the mouse a little shock on its foot pad. So eventually, when the mouse smelled cherry, it would just kind of, stay in the corner of the cage and be afraid to go out on the main platform because he knew it was going to get a foot shot. Now, the male mouse then reproduced with the female, and the baby mice were born. And sure enough, a good portion of the new mice, the new male mice, the new progeny, never trained to be afraid of the smell of cherry. As soon as they smelled that same ester, they were afraid, and they cowered in the corner. Now, what happened was that the gene that encoded the olfactory receptor for that ester had been chemically modified in the male mouse by what's called methylation. They're called methylation marks. And apparently the same thing happened in the sperm. And so the babies of the male mice inherited that same chemical modification and were born being afraid of the smell of cherries. Think about the implications of that for us. Think about living your life. Think about what we're going through and how we're epigenetically modifying our DNA and passing that on in one generation. First of all, it's not random. Now, we didn't get to mutations yet. This is a modification of DNA, not a mutation, right? But that's a trait that's being passed on with one generation. Darwin would be like, what? That would be just totally non-Darwinian. Then the question is mutations. Well, the fact is, when you epigenetically modify DNA, you think about 3 billion, billions of beads on a string, and you're folding it up in your hands, and the beads are red, yellow, green, or blue. And depending on how you fold it, this red bead might be inside, or that red bead might be outside, right? That's what the epigenetic modifications also do. In doing that, the red bead that's exposed now because of the epigenetic modification can be modified and mutated. The one that's inside is protected. So the actual physical structure of how you fold the DNA influences which bases of DNA can be mutated. And if our consciousness, our behavior, our habits affect the folding through epigenetics, we affect the mutations.
Thank you, Rudy. So, as you know, for
and Darwin couldn't have known that. So.
Darwin.
But there are people today
That's what
who are very strong followers of Darwin who should know this, who still argue otherwise.
So, since the year 2000, too. I've had this very contentious relationship with what are called militant atheists. The most prominent of them is Richard Dawkins, and he's a professor at Oxford, very highly respected, but very impressive. He has a British accent. He and I
Great
have
facial features. Great facial features. To go along.
So we have had this contentious argument for years, and when we wrote Super Genes, he tweeted, and by the way, he's blocked me on Twitter now.
Check.
He tweeted, what epigenetics?
I can't wait for epigenetics, after our book came out, I can't wait for epigenetics to have its 15 minutes of fame. So now that epigenetics is fully established, there are companies, there's no doubt about it. I recently retweeted that and said to him, I hope you can adapt.
Okay, so Rudy, I think you solved the heart problem.
And
There's no
hopefully
physical
Richard
word.
Dawkins doesn't watch this.
I'm going to send it to him.
No.
Rudy Tanzi, thank you.